I'm about to tell you about the moment when years of silence shattered with the sound of a single slap, the moment I realized that blood doesn't always mean love. I only stood up for what was mine, but that one decision changed everything. You might wonder, what could a daughter possibly do that led her own mother and brother to face justice in court? Don't scroll away, because the truth you're about to hear will keep you watching until the very end. My name is Andrea, and I'm 30 years old. I was born and raised in Seattle, Washington, in a family where love was never evenly shared. My parents, Norma and Dennis, had 2 children, me and my younger brother Frank. From as far back as I can remember, Frank was the golden child, the pride of the family, the one who could do no wrong. I, on the other hand, was the background noise, always told to understand or adjust, because I was the older one. It's strange how you can grow up surrounded by people and still feel invisible. I remember the small moments that built that feeling. When I brought home straight A's, my parents would nod and move on, as if excellence from me was expected. But when Frank passed a single test, the house would light up with celebration. My mother would bake his favorite chocolate cake, my father would clap his back proudly, and I'd sit quietly, pretending not to notice that my efforts never sparked such joy. Even at birthdays, there was an unspoken hierarchy. On my 9th birthday, I had begged for a small art set. Instead, my parents gave Frank a new bicycle and told me I could share it. I smiled for the camera that day, holding a half-eaten cupcake, while Frank posed proudly with his shiny blue bike. I still remember thinking, maybe next year they'll notice me. They never did. Growing up in that house meant learning the rules of silence. When Frank broke a window playing baseball, I was blamed for not watching him properly. When I accidentally spilled milk, it was called carelessness. Frank's mistakes were boys being boys, but mine were disappointments. Every word, every glance, taught me that affection was a privilege I hadn't earned. I learned early how to hide my feelings, to smile even when it hurt, because showing pain only made them tell me I was too sensitive. As I grew older, I tried to win their approval. I studied hard, stayed out of trouble, and followed every rule they set. I thought maybe if I was perfect, they'd finally look at me the way they looked at Frank. But nothing changed. When I told my parents I wanted to study computer science, my mother scoffed, saying, "That's too hard for girls. You should learn something practical, like teaching." My father didn't argue, he just shrugged and said, "Listen to your mother." Yet, when Frank said he wanted to start a gaming business with his friends, they not only encouraged him, they funded him. The business collapsed within months, but no one blamed him. They called it a learning experience. By the time I graduated high school, I'd learned 2 painful truths. My worth in that family would never equal my brother's, and no amount of achievement would change that. So I applied for scholarships in secret, determined to make my own way out. When I got accepted to a top university on a full scholarship, I was overjoyed. I ran home, clutching the acceptance letter, expecting at least a smile. My mother read it and said flatly, "So, you're leaving already? What will Frank do without you around?" My father simply said, "Well, I hope you can handle yourself. Life isn't easy." Frank didn't even look up from his phone. My excitement dimmed instantly. That night, I cried quietly into my pillow, but by morning, I made myself a promise. I would never again depend on them for validation. College was the first time I felt like I belonged somewhere. I worked part-time at a campus library, coded late into the night, and found friends who actually listened when I spoke. For the first time, my opinions mattered. But even then, the echoes of my childhood followed me. Every time I succeeded, I half expected someone to say, "It's not enough." That voice lived in my head for years. It took me a long time to realize that it wasn't my voice, it was theirs. During breaks, I'd go home, hoping things might have changed. But they never did. My mother would criticize my clothes, saying I looked too serious, while praising Frank for simply showing up. My father would ask me if I was seeing anyone, and when I said no, he'd sigh, as if my independence was a flaw. Frank, meanwhile, drifted from one failed job to another, yet was always treated like a victim of circumstance. Once, he asked me for money, and when I hesitated, my mother said, "You're so selfish. He's your brother." I gave it anyway, because guilt was the only currency that worked in that house. There were nights I'd lie awake in my dorm, thinking about how unfair it all was. But I didn't want pity, I wanted purpose. So I poured everything into my studies. I graduated with honors, secured an internship at a major tech firm, and built a life for myself one paycheck at a time. Each small victory reminded me that my future didn't belong to the people who doubted me, it belonged to the woman who refused to give up. Still, there was a part of me that longed for their approval, that tiny spark of hope that maybe someday they'd say, "We're proud of you." It never came. On my graduation day, my parents showed up late. My mother complained about the parking, my father asked where Frank should sit, and Frank, dressed like he'd just rolled out of bed, told everyone loudly that I'd probably end up working for him someday. The crowd laughed politely. I smiled through the humiliation, clutching my diploma like armor. That was the day I finally understood that family wasn't always love, it was sometimes just habit. Looking back now, I realize that being ignored shaped me more than any affection ever could. It made me independent, disciplined, and relentless. It taught me to build walls where there was no shelter, to find comfort in my own strength. And while their neglect scarred me, it also forged me. I didn't know it then, but every cruel word, every silent dinner, every moment I was overlooked was pushing me toward a version of myself that would one day stand tall, strong enough to face them, and brave enough to walk away. That was the foundation of my life, the quiet suffering that built a woman no one expected me to become. But as I would soon learn, even strength is tested when the people who once ignored you decide they want what you've built. Leaving home for college felt like stepping into another world. A world where no one knew my history, my family's favoritism, or how many times I'd cried myself to sleep. The campus in downtown Seattle was loud, alive, and full of strangers who carried their own stories. For the first time, I was free to write mine. I rented a small shared dorm room with a girl named Tasha, who became the first real friend I'd ever had. She was bright, talkative, and endlessly supportive, everything my home wasn't. She didn't see me as the quiet girl who needed to adjust. She saw me as Andrea, someone capable of anything. That small recognition gave me the courage I'd been missing all my life. Money was tight. My scholarship covered tuition, but not the endless list of expenses that came with living alone. Books, food, transportation, and all the small things my parents refused to help with. They said, "You chose this life, so learn to manage it." So, I did. I took a part-time job at the campus library, shelving books until midnight. I'd walk back to the dorm under the cold Seattle rain, clutching my backpack and reminding myself that every drop was a step toward freedom. I learned how to stretch a $20 bill for a week, how to cook cheap meals from ramen and canned vegetables, and how to smile through exhaustion. Some nights, I'd look out the dorm window and see city lights shimmering in the fog. They looked like stars trying to escape the darkness. I often felt the same way. I missed having someone to talk to, someone who cared if I ate or slept. My parents rarely called. When they did, it was only to ask how Frank was doing. My mother would say, "He misses you. You should check on him." Not once did she ask how I was managing. I'd hang up and whisper to myself, "I'm fine," even when I wasn't. Despite everything, I loved learning. Programming fascinated me, the logic, the creativity, the way you could build entire worlds with lines of code. I'd lose hours in front of my laptop, feeling in control for once. In coding, there were rules, structure, and justice. If you made an effort, the results showed. Unlike my family, the computer never played favorites. It rewarded precision and persistence, not charm. That made me fall in love with it even more. By my second year, I was juggling full-time classes and 2 part-time jobs. I worked at a coffee shop near campus on weekends, learning to make perfect lattes while pretending to enjoy customers' small talk. The tips helped pay my rent. My co-workers became my second family. People who didn't care about my background, only that I showed up and worked hard. That was enough for them. For me, it was everything. One day during winter break, when most students went home, I stayed behind. The dorms were nearly empty, and snow covered the campus lawns. I wrapped myself in a blanket and studied late into the night. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. No shouting, no judgment, no walking on eggshells. Just me, my notes, and silence. I realized then that loneliness wasn't always an enemy. Sometimes it was freedom in disguise. By junior year, I had become completely self-reliant. I fixed my own laptop when it crashed, filed my taxes, budgeted every penny, and learned to navigate life without leaning on anyone. But self-reliance came with a cost. I had built walls so high that I didn't know how to let anyone in. Tasha tried once, asking me to open up about my family. I brushed it off, saying, "They're just busy." She looked at me for a long time and replied, "Busy people still care." Her words stayed with me long after she left the room. There were days I broke down quietly, exhausted from pretending to be strong. Once, after pulling an all-nighter and failing an exam, I sat on a campus bench and cried behind my hoodie. No one stopped to ask if I was okay. And yet, I didn't resent it. I told myself, "You've survived worse than this." That sentence became my mantra, a shield against every setback. In my senior year, I applied for an internship at one of Seattle's top tech companies. I didn't think I'd get it. Competition was fierce, but I prepared for weeks. When I finally got the acceptance email, I stared at it for a long time, my hands trembling. I wanted to call my parents and tell them. I wanted to hear my mother's voice full of pride, my father saying he believed in me. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't call. I celebrated quietly with Tasha, who hugged me and said, "You did this on your own, Andrea. Never forget that." The internship was brutal, long hours, constant deadlines, but I thrived. For the first time, my hard work was recognized. My supervisor called me the most reliable intern we've had in years. I remember standing in the office elevator, watching my reflection in the metal doors, thinking, so this is what it feels like to be seen. When graduation approached, my parents finally decided to visit. I thought maybe things would be different this time. Maybe they'd see how far I'd come. But old patterns die hard. During the ceremony, my mother complained about the noise and my father asked where Frank could sit, so people will notice him too. Frank showed up late, wearing sunglasses indoors, and joked that he'd probably make more money without all this studying. My heart sank. I smiled for photos, but inside, I felt numb. The diploma in my hand meant freedom, but it also confirmed how alone I truly was. After the ceremony, while everyone took pictures with their families, I stood at the edge of the crowd, watching parents embrace their children. Tasha found me and asked softly, "Aren't your parents staying for dinner?" I shook my head. They said they have somewhere to be. She looked at me like she wanted to say something comforting, but I just smiled and whispered, "I'm used to it." That night, back in my apartment, I hung my graduation cap on the wall and sat in silence. I thought about every lonely night, every job, every sacrifice. It hurt knowing my parents would never understand what it took for me to reach that moment. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice said, "You made it anyway." And that was enough. College didn't just teach me how to code or survive, it taught me how to exist without needing approval. I learned that family doesn't always mean love, and love doesn't always mean kindness. By the time I accepted my first full-time job, I wasn't the invisible girl from my parents' house anymore. I was Andrea, the woman who had built her own life, brick by brick, from the ashes of neglect. I didn't know it yet, but my journey was only beginning. The real test, the one that would define who I truly was still waiting in the years ahead. Life after college began with a rush of nervous energy. I was 23 when I walked into the glass tower of a Seattle tech company for my first day as a junior software engineer. The office smelled like coffee and ambition. People rushing between meetings, screens glowing with lines of code, the hum of creativity everywhere. I remember standing by the elevator, clutching my badge, thinking, this is where my life really starts. The first few months were tough. I was the youngest on my team, surrounded by seasoned developers who spoke in shorthand about systems I was still learning to understand. But instead of letting that intimidate me, I absorbed everything. I stayed late, volunteered for extra projects, and turned every mistake into a lesson. Some nights, I'd still be at my desk when the janitor made his rounds, my screen casting a pale blue glow across the quiet office. I wasn't just coding software, I was rewriting the story of my life, line by line. My supervisors noticed. Within a year, I was promoted to software engineer too. The day my manager called me into his office and said, "Andrea, your work ethic is outstanding. You're an asset to this team," I almost couldn't speak. No one had ever said words like that to me before. I walked out of that office with tears in my eyes, pretending it was just the bright fluorescent lights. It was the first time I realized I didn't need my family's approval anymore. I was earning my own. My apartment back then was small but mine. A one-bedroom space in downtown Seattle with squeaky floors and a leaky faucet. Still, every night when I came home from work, I'd smile. It wasn't much, but it was proof that I had built something all on my own. I'd cook dinner while listening to soft jazz, sometimes losing myself in memories of what it felt like to be overlooked. Now, no one could take that away. As years passed, my career took off. I became known for solving problems others couldn't. My coding style was clean, efficient, and reliable. I wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but when I spoke, people listened. By 28, I was leading a small team on a high-profile project. It was intense, but I thrived under pressure. Every completed milestone felt like a small victory against the ghosts of my past. Then came the moment that changed everything, the bonus announcement. My manager praised me in front of the entire department for leading a project that brought in a major client. I received a promotion to senior software engineer, a 5-figure bonus, and the chance to buy something I'd dreamed about for years, my own penthouse. The day I signed the papers, I couldn't stop shaking. I walked through the empty apartment, high above the city, and let the silence fill me. The walls were white, the view endless. Below, Seattle glimmered like a field of diamonds. I ran my hand over the cool marble countertop, the large windows framing the skyline, and thought every tear, every lonely night, it all led here. When I called my parents to tell them, I expected at least a hint of pride. Instead, my mother's voice was sharp. "A penthouse? Don't you think that's excessive for a single woman?" My father said, "That's a lot of responsibility. Maybe you should let Frank move in and help manage the place." I froze. The same script, the same dismissive tone, after all these years. "No," I said quietly. "I bought it for myself." My mother's voice turned cold. "You've become selfish, Andrea. You used to be such a good daughter." I hung up before the argument could go further. The joy I'd felt moments before faded like a dying light. Still, I refused to let their words ruin what I'd earned. I spent the following weeks decorating the penthouse with things that made me happy. Plants, abstract art, bookshelves filled with novels I loved. Every corner reflected a piece of my journey. On Friday nights, I'd sit on the balcony with a glass of wine, watching the city lights flicker like old memories. I told myself, "You did this. You don't need anyone's approval to be proud of it." But family ties have a way of creeping back in. Not long after, Frank called out of the blue. His voice was casual, almost too friendly. "Hey sis," he said. "I heard about the place. Must be nice living the dream." I hesitated but replied politely. He continued, "Mom says you've got plenty of space. Maybe I could crash for a while? Things are rough right now." My instinct screamed no, but guilt made me pause. I told him I'd think about it. The next morning, my mother called, insisting, "He's your brother, Andrea. Family helps each other." Her tone made it clear. It wasn't a request. I took a deep breath and said, "Not this time, Mom." She hung up without another word. At work, my team noticed I'd become quieter. My manager asked if everything was okay, and I lied, saying I was just tired. In truth, I was exhausted from fighting invisible battles, between my success and my family's resentment, between independence and guilt. No matter how far I climbed, their disapproval followed like a shadow. Still, I kept moving forward. Over the next year, I began mentoring junior developers, teaching them what no one had taught me, how to believe in yourself when no one else does. Watching them grow gave me peace. I saw in them the same hunger I'd once carried. My penthouse became my sanctuary, a place untouched by criticism or comparison. Sometimes, when I looked out at the skyline, I'd imagine the younger version of myself standing beside me. I'd tell her, "You made it. You survived." And in those quiet moments, I finally started to believe it. Success didn't erase the pain of my past, but it gave it meaning. Every hardship became a stepping stone, every rejection a reason to rise higher. I wasn't just a software engineer, I was living proof that neglect couldn't define me. I had built something unshakable, my own life, my own peace, my own worth. But peace has its enemies. As my career soared and my independence solidified, I couldn't have known that my success would ignite a storm within my family. One that would soon test every boundary I had worked so hard to build. The first few weeks after moving into my penthouse were supposed to be the happiest of my life. Every morning, I woke up to sunlight pouring through the tall glass windows, illuminating a space that finally felt like mine. It was peaceful, quiet in a way I'd never known before. I thought I had finally closed the chapter on the years of being ignored and diminished. But peace doesn't last long when envy lives in the people you once called family. It started subtly. My mother, Norma, would call and ask little questions wrapped in concern. "Do you really need such a big place all alone?" she'd ask. "Wouldn't it be better if Frank stayed with you? At least you'd have company." My father, Dennis, would sigh in the background, saying nothing but clearly agreeing with her. I tried to brush it off, reminding myself that they had always found a way to make my accomplishments seem unnecessary. But something about their tone this time was different. Less curious, more expectant. A few days later, Frank showed up at my door unannounced. I opened it to see him standing there with a smug grin and a suitcase in hand. "Hey sis," he said casually, as if he was expected. "Mom said you wouldn't mind if I stayed for a bit." My stomach dropped. "She said what?" I asked. "You know how things are," he continued, walking past me without waiting for permission. "I lost my job again, but I just need a place to crash until I figure things out." I stood frozen, unsure whether to laugh or scream. "Frank, this is my home. You can't just move in without asking me." He gave me a half smirk, half sneer. "It's just temporary. Don't be dramatic." I wanted to say no, to make him pack up and leave right then. But a familiar wave of guilt washed over me, the same guilt my mother had used against me since childhood. So I let him stay, convincing myself it would only be for a few days. Within a week, my sanctuary turned into chaos. Frank left dirty dishes everywhere, used my expensive towels, and blasted music in the middle of the night. When I confronted him, he rolled his eyes. "Relax, Andrea. You're acting like some control freak." The arrogance in his voice reminded me of every moment I had been silenced growing up. He'd invite friends over without telling me, turning my home into a hangout spot. Once, I came home from work to find 3 strangers lounging on my couch eating takeout. Frank just shrugged and said, "You weren't using the place anyway." I tried to reason with him. "Frank, this is my home, not yours. I need space. I have a job that demands focus." He scoffed. "You think you're better than us now, huh? Just because you've got some fancy job and an apartment with a view." His words stung, not because they were true, but because they came from someone who had never lifted a finger to build anything for himself. When I told my mother what was happening, she took his side instantly. "He's your brother, Andrea," she scolded. "You should help him. He's going through a rough time." I clenched my jaw. "Mom, he's not helping himself. He's taking advantage of me." She laughed lightly, the way she always did when dismissing my pain. "You've always been so selfish. You have everything, and yet you can't share with your own family." Her words hit harder than I wanted to admit. I hung up the phone and cried in silence that night, realizing no matter how successful I became, they'd always find a way to make me feel small. Frank stayed longer than promised. One evening, he threw a party while I was out late at work. When I came home, I found my living room trashed, spilled drinks, cigarette burns on my rug, broken glass near the counter. My heart pounded with anger. What the hell happened here? I shouted. Frank just leaned against the wall, laughing with his friends. "Chill out, Andrea. We were celebrating your success." I looked around at the mess. My success, reduced to a mockery. "Get out," I said coldly. His smirk faded. "What did you say?" I repeated, "Get out." I want you out of my house tonight. He laughed bitterly. You're unbelievable. You've changed. Mom was right about you. Then he stormed into the guest room, slammed the door, and refused to leave. The next day, I found that he had called my mother, twisting the story. Within an hour, she called me, furious. Andrea, how dare you throw your brother out? He's family. You've become heartless. My father's voice came faintly from the background. She's right, Andrea. You shouldn't turn your back on your own blood. I took a deep breath and said quietly, you never cared when I was alone, when I was struggling. But now that I've built something for myself, suddenly I owe you everything. My mother's voice rose sharply, don't talk to me like that. We raised you. That was the first time in my life I didn't back down. You raised me to believe I was less than him, I said, my voice trembling but steady. And I'm done believing it. Then I hung up. The silence after that call felt heavier than anything I'd ever known. I sat on my couch surrounded by the ruins of my once perfect home, realizing this wasn't just about Frank moving in, it was about power. My family didn't hate my success because they needed help. They hated it because it proved I didn't need them. For weeks, the tension grew. My mother stopped calling to ask how I was. Instead, she called to guilt-trip me about abandoning family values. My father sent me long texts about forgiveness and understanding, while Frank posted pictures online from my penthouse, pretending it was his. The final straw came when one of his friends joked in the comments, nice place, man. Must be good to have a generous sister. That night, I made my decision. I walked to the guest room, where Frank was sprawled out watching TV, and said calmly, you have 24 hours to leave. He looked at me, disbelief flashing across his face. You can't be serious. I met his eyes and said, dead serious. The next day, I changed the locks. When my mother found out, she exploded. How could you humiliate your brother like that? She screamed over the phone. You've brought shame to this family. I let her finish, then replied quietly, you shamed me long before this day came. I'm just taking back my life. That night, as I looked out over the city lights from my balcony, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. I had finally stood up for myself, but I knew it wasn't over. I could already sense that something bigger was coming. A confrontation that would tear whatever fragile bond we still had apart. I didn't know when or how, but deep down I knew, the storm had only just begun. It had been a few tense weeks since I forced Frank out of my home. My phone was quieter than ever. No more late-night guilt calls from my mother, no sarcastic texts from Frank, no messages from my father trying to play peacekeeper. For the first time in months, my apartment was peaceful again. I could breathe, sleep, and focus on my work without the constant feeling of being watched or judged. Still, that silence carried a weight I couldn't ignore. I knew my family. They weren't done. They were just waiting for the right moment to strike back. That moment came one Friday evening when I received a call from my father. His voice was unusually soft, almost cautious. Andrea, he said, your mother wants to have a family dinner. Nothing serious, just a get-together. It's been too long. I hesitated. My gut told me it wasn't a good idea. Dad, the last time I saw everyone, it didn't go well. I know, he said quickly. But things have cooled down. Your mother just wants to talk. Maybe we can clear the air. I wanted to believe him. A part of me still longed for peace, for the impossible dream that one dinner could fix years of resentment. Against my better judgment, I agreed. All right, I said softly. I'll come. The dinner was set for Saturday evening at my parents' house, the same home I'd grown up in, where I had learned that love came with conditions. As I drove there, the sky was dark and heavy with rain clouds. Seattle drizzle began tapping against my windshield, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the weather knew something I didn't. When I arrived, the house was buzzing with guests. It wasn't just a small family dinner, it was a full gathering. My mother's relatives, old family friends, and even some neighbors were there, chatting and laughing. My chest tightened. Why would she invite so many people if this was supposed to be a peaceful dinner? I walked in, smiling politely, trying to ignore the curious stares. My mother, Norma, appeared from the kitchen in a silk blouse and pearls, her face painted with the perfect host's smile. "Andrea, you made it," she said smoothly, as if nothing had happened. "Come in, dear. Everyone's been dying to see you." "Dying to see me or dying to gossip about me?" I muttered under my breath. She ignored my comment and gestured toward the dining room. "Dinner will be served soon. Go sit with your brother, he's in the living room." Frank was sitting on the couch, legs stretched out like he owned the place. When he saw me, he smirked. "Well, look who decided to show up. Miss Seattle Tech Queen." "Nice to see you too," I replied flatly. He laughed under his breath. "Still touchy, huh? You know, Mom and Dad just want what's best for the family. Maybe tonight you can stop acting like you're better than everyone." I crossed my arms. "Wanting respect isn't arrogance, Frank. You wouldn't understand that." Before he could respond, my mother called everyone to the dining table. There were nearly 20 people seated, relatives I hadn't seen in years, all smiling politely but watching closely. As I sat down, I felt like I was under a microscope. The table was covered in candles, fine china, and expensive food, but the air was thick with unspoken tension. Dinner began pleasantly enough. Small talk, laughter, the clinking of glasses. My mother played the gracious hostess perfectly. But halfway through, she tapped her glass with a spoon, drawing everyone's attention. "I'd like to make a little announcement," she began, her tone sweet but calculated. "As you all know, my daughter Andrea has been doing quite well lately. She's bought herself a beautiful penthouse in the city. We're all very proud of her." There were polite nods and murmurs of congratulations. I forced a smile. But then her tone shifted. "And being the generous daughter she is, she's decided to give that penthouse to her brother Frank. Isn't that wonderful?" For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. The entire table clapped politely, while my heartbeat roared in my ears. I looked at her, frozen. "What did you just say?" My mother smiled wider, her voice dripping with sweetness. "You said you wanted to help your brother, remember? This is the perfect opportunity." I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. "No," I said firmly. The laughter and chatter around the table died instantly. "I never said that. That's not true." My mother's smile faltered. "Andrea, don't make a scene." "I'm not making a scene," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You're lying in front of everyone. I bought that home with my hard work. It's mine." Frank stood up too, his face red with embarrassment. "What's your problem, Andrea? You can't even share? You have everything, and I'm just asking for a little help." "You're not asking," I snapped. "You're taking. Just like you always have." Gasps rippled through the room. My mother's face hardened, her mask slipping. "Andrea, sit down. You're humiliating this family." "No, Mom," I said, my voice breaking. "You humiliated me my entire life. You made me believe I was never enough. And now that I've built something for myself, you want to hand it over to him." The silence that followed was sharp as glass. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "You ungrateful," she began, but Frank interrupted her, shouting, "Enough." Before I could react, Frank lunged forward and slapped me across the face. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. The world froze. My head snapped to the side, my cheek burning with pain. Gasps filled the air. Someone dropped a glass. For a moment, I couldn't move. I could barely breathe. My brother, the same boy I once protected, the one I defended as a child, had just hit me in front of our entire family. "Frank!" my father shouted, standing up, but my mother grabbed his arm. "Don't," she hissed. "She brought this on herself." I stared at her, disbelief flooding every inch of me. "You're defending him?" I whispered. "After what he just did?" My mother crossed her arms, her voice sharp and cold. "You embarrassed him. You embarrassed all of us." Tears filled my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. My grandfather, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table, suddenly stood up. "That's enough." His voice thundered through the silence. "I've seen enough cruelty in this family to last a lifetime. "Andrea, you did nothing wrong." He turned toward my parents, his face flushed with anger. "You failed as parents. And you," he pointed at Frank, "should be ashamed of yourself." My mother tried to speak, but he cut her off. "Silence, Norma. I raised you better than this." I looked around at all the faces, some horrified, some pretending not to see anything at all. My heart broke in that moment, not because of the slap, but because no one else said a word. They all just watched. I straightened myself, wiped my tears, and said softly, "You'll never touch me or my life again." Then I walked out. My grandfather followed me to the door. "Andrea," he said gently, "you did the right thing. Don't go back." Outside, the cold rain hit my face, mixing with my tears. My cheek still burned, but inside me, something else had started to burn too, resolve. I realized then that this wasn't just about respect anymore. It was about justice. As I drove back to my penthouse, the city lights blurred through the rain. My reflection in the window looked tired but fierce. The little girl who once begged to be noticed was gone. In her place stood a woman who had finally drawn the line. That night, I sat on my couch, holding an ice pack to my swollen cheek, and whispered to myself, "They've taken enough from me. It ends now." The next morning, I called my lawyer. The morning after the dinner still felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. My cheek was swollen and sore, the echo of that slap still ringing in my ears. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. My mother's cold stare, my brother's rage, the stunned silence of the people who did nothing. I sat in my living room, the sunlight filtering through the blinds, holding a cup of untouched coffee. For years, I had endured their cruelty in silence. But last night changed everything. I wasn't that powerless girl anymore. I had built my own life, my own identity, and now they had crossed the line. I opened my phone and saw dozens of messages. Some were from relatives who had witnessed the scene, others from people who had heard the story through whispers. Most were shallow attempts to check if I was okay. None offered accountability. My mother's message sat at the top: "You embarrassed this family. Don't come near us again until you learn respect." I stared at it for a long time before deleting it. Then, with shaking hands, I scrolled to my contacts and tapped on Victoria, the lawyer who had helped me review my apartment's contract when I bought it. When she picked up, her voice was calm but alert. "Andrea? Are you all right?" I swallowed hard. "No, I'm not." We met that afternoon at her office downtown, a tall glass building overlooking the bay. The place was quiet, sterile, professional. As soon as I sat down across from her, I felt my composure slipping. "Tell me everything," she said gently. So I did. Every word. From the years of neglect to the manipulation, from Frank's intrusion into my home to the public slap that shattered whatever was left of my family bond. Victoria listened intently, occasionally jotting notes but mostly just letting me speak. By the time I finished, my hands were trembling, but my heart felt lighter. When I finally looked up, she was leaning forward, her expression firm. "Andrea, what happened to you is not just emotional abuse, it's assault and public humiliation. You have every right to take legal action." "I don't want revenge," I said quietly. "I just want them to stop. To never come near me again." "That's not revenge," she replied. "That's justice. And we'll make sure you get it." Hearing those words felt like oxygen. For so long, I had been gaslight into believing that standing up for myself was selfish. But now, for the first time, someone saw the truth. Victoria outlined my options. "First, we'll file an assault charge against your brother. The fact that it happened in front of witnesses makes the case strong. Then, we can pursue a restraining order against your mother and him, preventing any contact or harassment. If your parents attempt to smear your reputation or manipulate you further, we'll include that as emotional abuse under the protection order." I nodded, absorbing her words. "Will they really face consequences?" "If they're found guilty," she said, "your brother could face community service or even jail time. Your mother could face probation and counseling requirements. But the most important thing, you'll get your peace." As I signed the initial paperwork, my hand shook slightly. I wasn't scared, I was just overwhelmed. Every signature felt like reclaiming a part of myself that they had stolen. When I was done, Victoria looked at me and said, "You've carried this alone for too long, Andrea. You don't have to anymore." That night, I returned home to my quiet penthouse. For the first time, it didn't feel empty, it felt safe. I stood by the balcony, looking over the glittering Seattle skyline, the rain washing the city clean. I wanted to believe it was washing me clean too, of guilt, of fear, of the need to be loved by people who never truly did. The next morning, the process began. Victoria contacted the authorities, submitting my formal statement and witness list. I included my grandfather's name. He had seen everything and had already called me, promising his support. "You have my word," he had said firmly. "I won't let them twist this against you." His voice cracked a little, and I could hear the regret in it. "I should have protected you sooner." Hearing that brought tears to my eyes. "You are protecting me now," I told him. Within days, the police contacted me for a follow-up. They were professional, kind, and efficient. Officer Blake, who led the case, assured me, "We'll handle this by the book. No one has the right to put their hands on you, not even family." Meanwhile, my parents found out about the case. The messages began again. Angry, manipulative, full of threats disguised as concern. "You've destroyed this family, Andrea. How could you take this to court?" Another message came from my father, "We can settle this privately. Don't ruin your brother's life over a mistake." I didn't reply. I forwarded everything to Victoria, who simply said, "You did the right thing. Don't engage." Days turned into weeks as the legal process moved forward. Frank was officially charged with misdemeanor assault, and both he and my mother were served restraining orders. My lawyer also helped me file a no trespass order on my property. The day the sign went up outside my building, "Private residence, no entry without permission," I felt a sense of liberation I had never known. It wasn't just a sign. It was a declaration that I finally owned my peace. Still, nights were difficult. Sometimes I'd wake up from dreams of the dinner scene, my heart pounding, my cheek burning all over again. Other nights, I'd scroll through old photos, wondering how I could have loved people who hurt me so deeply. But each morning, when I woke to the view of the city skyline, I reminded myself, this is what survival looks like. A month later, I met with Victoria again to review the progress. "The case is moving well," she said. "The evidence and witness statements are solid. The court date will be set soon." I nodded, feeling calm for the first time in a long while. "Thank you," I said. "Not just for the legal help, for reminding me that I'm not crazy for wanting respect." She smiled. "Andrea, people who grow up neglected often believe they have to earn love. You don't. You just have to protect your peace." That night, I sat by my window, the lights of Seattle twinkling like tiny promises. For years, I'd been the silent daughter, the scapegoat, the one who endured everything quietly. But now, the silence had ended. I poured myself a cup of tea, held it close and whispered, "They broke my trust, but they can't break me." For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of being alone. I wasn't waiting for an apology or a miracle. I had become my own justice, and I knew this was only the beginning of my freedom. The day of the hearing arrived faster than I expected. The morning air in Seattle was damp and heavy, and the city's rhythm felt strangely muted, as if it too was holding its breath. I stood outside the courthouse, my palms cold despite the warmth of my coffee cup. For years, I had walked into rooms where I felt small, family dinners, living rooms, reunions, but today was different. Today, I was walking into a room where my voice would finally matter. Victoria met me on the courthouse steps, her briefcase in hand and her expression calm yet focused. "You ready?" she asked softly. I nodded, though my heart thudded in my chest. As ready as I'll ever be. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. A low hum of voices filled the space. Lawyers, clerks, a few curious onlookers. I spotted my parents and Frank seated at the defendant's table. My mother's chin was held high, her lips pursed with self-righteous fury. My father looked tired and avoided eye contact, while Frank sat back with his arms crossed, feigning confidence. Seeing them made something inside me tighten. These were the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. Instead, they had turned my pain into a public spectacle. But as I sat beside Victoria, I felt a quiet strength returning. I wasn't the frightened daughter anymore. I was the woman they had underestimated. Judge Miller entered, and everyone rose. He was a tall, composed man with a calm yet piercing presence. As we sat again, he reviewed the file briefly, then said, "We are here to address the assault case filed by Andrea Carter against her brother, Frank Carter, with additional claims regarding emotional harassment involving the defendant's mother, Norma Carter." My mother's jaw twitched, but she said nothing. The prosecutor called the first witness, Officer Blake, the responding officer who handled my initial report. He described how the witnesses at the dinner confirmed the altercation. His calm, professional tone was like a balm to my nerves. Every detail he gave, every confirmation, felt like a small piece of justice settling into place. Then it was my turn. My hands trembled slightly as I took the oath, but when I looked at Judge Miller, something in his eyes reminded me that truth didn't need embellishment, it just needed courage. "Miss Carter," the prosecutor began, "can you describe what happened on the night of the incident?" I nodded slowly. It was supposed to be a family dinner. My father invited me, saying it was a chance to reconcile. But when I arrived, I realized it wasn't a simple dinner, it was a setup. My mother made an announcement claiming I had agreed to give my penthouse to my brother. When I said that wasn't true, she called me selfish. My brother stood up, shouted at me, and then hit me across the face in front of everyone. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Frank shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The prosecutor leaned closer. "And how did your family react?" I took a deep breath. My mother defended him. She said I embarrassed the family. My father didn't stop it. I walked out because I realized nothing would ever change if I stayed silent. Victoria gave me a reassuring nod from her seat. I continued, "That night, I decided I wouldn't let them hurt me again. I filed a report the next morning. It wasn't about revenge, it was about ending the cycle." When I finished, the courtroom fell silent. Judge Miller's expression remained neutral, but I saw the faintest flicker of empathy in his eyes. Then it was my mother's turn to take the stand. She adjusted her pearl necklace dramatically and began her performance. "Your Honor, my daughter has always been difficult. We were trying to help her see reason. The house she bought was far too big for her alone. Her brother was struggling. We thought it would be good for her to share. She misunderstood everything." The prosecutor interjected, "Mrs. Carter, are you denying that your son physically assaulted your daughter in front of witnesses?" She hesitated, her mask slipping for just a second. "He didn't mean to. It was a moment of anger. Families argue all the time." "So you consider striking your daughter across the face an argument?" the prosecutor asked sharply. My mother's lips thinned. She provoked him. The courtroom gasped. Even my father flinched. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Careful with your words, Mrs. Carter." Next came my grandfather, the quiet witness who had carried the weight of truth since that night. He walked slowly to the stand, leaning on his cane, but his voice was firm. "I was there," he said clearly. "I saw it all." Andrea spoke with dignity. She was calm. It was Frank who lost control. He hit her hard enough to make everyone gasp. Norma didn't stop him. In fact, she blamed Andrea for it. He paused, his voice trembling with emotion. "I've seen this family turn love into power for years, and I won't stay silent anymore." Tears pricked my eyes. Hearing him speak those words, so honest, so brave, felt like a balm to every wound I had carried. When the defense tried to downplay the incident, claiming it was a private family dispute, the judge stopped them. "A family bond does not excuse violence," he said sternly. "This court protects the victim, regardless of relation." The verdict was announced later that afternoon. The room was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. Judge Miller looked at Frank first. "You showed aggression toward your sister in a public setting and caused emotional harm. You are sentenced to 200 hours of community service, mandatory anger management classes, and a written public apology to the plaintiff." Any violation of this order will result in jail time. Frank's face turned pale. His arrogance drained instantly. Then the judge turned to my mother. Mrs. Carter, your conduct, your attempt to manipulate, your public humiliation of your daughter, and your defense of violence, is reprehensible. You are fined $2,000 and sentenced to 6 months of probation, along with mandatory counseling for emotional abuse. Consider this an opportunity to reflect on what motherhood truly means. My mother's mouth opened in shock, but no words came out. Finally, Judge Miller looked at me. Miss Carter, this court acknowledges your courage in standing up against domestic and emotional abuse. The restraining orders remain in effect. You are under full legal protection. No contact from either defendant will be permitted. I nodded, tears finally falling, not from pain but relief. As we stepped out of the courtroom, Victoria smiled at me. Justice served, she said simply. Outside, the sky was bright for the first time in weeks. The air felt lighter. My grandfather approached me slowly, his eyes wet with emotion. I'm proud of you, Andrea, he whispered. You did what I couldn't do years ago. I hugged him tightly. Thank you for standing with me, I said. He smiled faintly. You've reminded this family what strength really looks like. As I walked down the courthouse steps, I realized something profound. The victory wasn't just legal, it was spiritual. For years, they had tried to silence me, to mold me into something obedient and small. But standing in that courtroom, telling the truth out loud, had shattered the power they held over me. That night, back in my penthouse, I opened the windows and let the cool evening breeze in. The city glowed beneath me, full of possibility. I whispered to myself, it's over. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just an ending. It was the beginning of a life where I finally owned my voice, my peace, and my freedom. The weeks following the verdict felt strangely quiet. For the first time in my life, there was no chaos waiting at the end of the day, no phone calls laced with guilt, no family voices echoing through my mind. Just silence, pure, unfamiliar silence. Yet, even in that calm, I felt something heavy sitting inside me, like a wound that had healed on the outside but still hurt deep beneath the skin. I had won my case, but peace wasn't something a judge could grant. It had to come from within. One afternoon, Victoria suggested I see a therapist. You fought hard, Andrea, she told me, but the fight changes you. Healing takes a different kind of strength. Her words stayed with me. That evening, I searched online for someone who specialized in emotional trauma and family abuse. The next week, I met Dr. Elaine Turner. She was in her mid-40s, with kind eyes and a soft but steady voice, the kind that made you feel seen without being exposed. Our first session was quiet at first. I sat on her leather couch, staring at a painting of an ocean hanging on the wall. You can start wherever you like, she said gently. I hesitated before speaking. I don't even know what to say. I've spent my whole life trying not to talk about things. That's perfectly fine, she replied. We'll take it slow. Over the next few weeks, I found myself opening up piece by piece. I told her about my childhood, how my mother's approval was a prize I could never win, how my brother was worshipped for mediocrity while I was punished for effort. I described the slap, the courtroom, and the hollow kind of victory that followed. Each time I spoke, the words felt raw, but lighter somehow, like I was unpacking years of weight I didn't realize I was carrying. Dr. Turner listened without judgment. Sometimes she asked questions that pierced straight through my defenses. Andrea, when you think of love, what do you feel? I paused for a long moment before answering. Fear, I said finally. Because love to me always came with a price. She nodded slowly. That's the trauma speaking. You learned that affection was conditional. But love, real love, shouldn't demand your silence or your suffering. Her words hit deeper than I expected. I realized that even after cutting ties, I still carried my family's voice in my head. Every time I felt happy, I waited for something bad to happen. Every time I succeeded, I felt guilty, as if I didn't deserve it. Healing wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about reprogramming the way I saw myself. Outside therapy, I started small rituals to rebuild my peace. I began morning walks around the quiet streets near my building, letting the cold Seattle air clear my thoughts. I filled my penthouse with soft music and fresh flowers, reminding myself that beauty didn't need permission to exist. I learned to cook for one, not out of loneliness, but as an act of self-care. There was something liberating about sitting by the window, eating dinner alone, and feeling completely whole. Dr. Turner once asked me, if your younger self could see you now, what would she say? I smiled faintly. She'd probably cry, I said. Because she spent years thinking no one would ever believe her pain. By my 4th month of therapy, I had stopped waking up in the middle of the night replaying the dinner scene. The nightmares faded, replaced by a calm I had never known. I began journaling every night. Writing letters I'd never send, conversations I wished I'd had. One night I wrote, "You can't heal where you were hurt, but you can bloom somewhere new." That became my favorite line, a quiet reminder that moving on wasn't betrayal, it was survival. One morning, Dr. Turner told me to close my eyes and picture a place where I felt safe. I saw my penthouse, but it wasn't just the walls or the furniture. It was the feeling of standing there as a woman who finally chose herself. "That's your sanctuary," she said softly. "And the beautiful thing is, you built it." There were setbacks, of course. Some days, I'd scroll through old photos or catch a glimpse of families in coffee shops and feel an ache of longing. The idea of family still hurt. I didn't miss them, I missed the version of them I'd wished they could be. Dr. Turner helped me understand that grief and healing could exist together. "You can mourn what never was," she said, "and still be grateful for what's ahead." Slowly, I began letting new people into my life. Colleagues, neighbors, a small group of friends who valued kindness over control. We'd meet for coffee, share stories, laugh about nothing. It wasn't a replacement for family, it was a rediscovery of what connection should feel like. Genuine, gentle, unconditional. One evening, I found myself standing on my balcony, the city glowing beneath a sunset that painted the sky in soft pinks and golds. I realized how much I had changed. The girl who once begged to be seen was now content in her own company. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't waiting for an apology that would never come. I had learned to give myself the compassion I'd been denied. In our last session before a short break, Dr. Turner asked, "How do you feel now, Andrea?" I thought for a moment before answering. "Peaceful," I said. "Not because everything's perfect, but because I'm finally free from trying to fix what was never mine to fix." She smiled warmly. "That's healing, Andrea, not forgetting the pain, but remembering your strength." That night, I sat in my living room with a candle burning beside me, its flame soft and steady. I opened my journal and wrote, "Peace doesn't come when the world changes. It comes when you do." And as I watched the candle flicker, I knew the worst was behind me. The future wasn't a place I feared anymore. It was a story I was ready to write. 4 months passed after the court verdict, and with each passing week, I felt lighter. I no longer woke up to fear or guilt. My days had rhythm now: work, therapy, walks by the water, dinners for one that no longer felt lonely. The wounds were healing, slowly but steadily. Still, there were moments when a quiet ache surfaced, especially when I thought of my father. Dennis had always been the silent observer in the chaos of my family. He wasn't cruel like my mother, nor reckless like Frank, but his silence had done its own damage. He was the man who had watched everything happen and never once stood up for me. So when an email from him appeared in my inbox one afternoon, my heart clenched. The subject line was simple: "I'd like to talk." For a long time, I stared at it without opening it. Part of me wanted to delete it immediately, to preserve the peace I had finally found. But curiosity and an old, fragile hope made me click. The message was brief. He wrote that he had been thinking about everything that had happened and that he wanted to meet, just to talk. No manipulation, no guilt, just an apology, if I was willing to hear it. I forwarded the message to Victoria for advice. She called me back quickly. "You're under no obligation to meet him," she said gently. "But if you do, set clear boundaries. Choose a public place. Make it on your terms." 2 days later, I agreed to meet him at a small cafe near Pike Place Market. It was neutral ground, public, open, impossible for any confrontation to spiral. I arrived early, sitting by the window with my coffee, watching the drizzle streak down the glass. The air smelled of roasted beans and ocean salt from the nearby pier. I was nervous, but not afraid. When my father walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked older, his hair grayer, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if the weight of everything had finally settled. When he saw me, his eyes softened. "Andrea," he said quietly. I nodded, keeping my voice even. "Hi, Dad." We sat in silence for a few minutes, the clinking of cups around us filling the space between us. Finally, he spoke. "You look good," he said. "Healthier. Happier." "I am," I replied simply. He sighed and stared down at his hands. "I know I don't have the right to ask for your time. But I needed to see you, to say I'm sorry." The words hung in the air like something fragile, almost foreign. I watched him closely, waiting for the excuses that always came after apologies in my family. But this time, they didn't. He looked genuinely remorseful. "I should have protected you," he continued. "From your mother. From Frank. From the way our home became so cruel. I saw it all, Andrea. I saw how they treated you, and I said nothing. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. I told myself I was keeping the peace. But all I did was let the wrong people win." His voice cracked. "And I will regret that for the rest of my life." I felt something tighten in my chest, a mixture of sadness and release. Hearing him acknowledge what I had suffered was something I'd never expected. "Why now?" I asked quietly. He looked up at me, his eyes glistening. "Because I watched you stand in that courtroom and tell the truth without fear. I saw a strength in you that I never had. You reminded me what courage looks like. I realized I spent my life avoiding conflict, pretending silence was kindness. But silence is just another form of cruelty when it protects the wrong people." I swallowed hard. "Do you still talk to them?" He hesitated. "Your mother refuses to admit she did anything wrong. She says you've turned against us. I moved out 2 weeks ago. I couldn't live in that denial anymore. Frank, well, he's distant. Angry, mostly at himself, I think. He lost his job again." I didn't respond right away. The old Andrea would have felt guilt, maybe even pity. But now, I just felt calm. "That's not my responsibility," I said softly. He nodded. "I know. I just thought you should know I'm done enabling them." We sat in silence again, this time without tension. There was something real in the quiet, something honest. My father looked at me like a man seeing his daughter for the first time, not as someone fragile or defiant, but as someone strong. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said finally. "I just hope that maybe someday, you'll let me be part of your life again. Even in a small way." I thought about it for a moment. I remembered the years he'd sat silently at the dinner table, watching my mother humiliate me. But I also remembered the small kindnesses, how he'd quietly slip extra money into my backpack before college, how he'd once waited outside in the car when my mother wouldn't let me go to a friend's house, how he'd always looked at me like he wanted to say something but couldn't. "I can't promise anything," I said at last. "But I can start by hearing you. That's something." He nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. "That's more than I deserve." As we left the cafe, the rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking apart, letting thin sunlight spill through. We stood outside awkwardly for a moment before he said, "Take care of yourself, Andrea." "I will," I replied. "You too, Dad." He smiled faintly. "I'm proud of you, you know. I just wish I'd said it sooner." I watched him walk away down the wet street until he disappeared into the crowd. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no embrace, no promises of a perfect future, just two people finally telling the truth after a lifetime of silence. And somehow, that was enough. That evening, I sat on my balcony, a warm blanket wrapped around me as the city lights shimmered below. The air was cool, but I felt peaceful. My father's apology hadn't erased the past, but it had mended something inside me. For the first time, I felt that the story of my family didn't have to end in bitterness, it could end in understanding. As the night deepened, I whispered to myself, forgiveness isn't about letting them back in. It's about letting myself move on. And with that, I closed my eyes and let the quiet of the city carry me into a kind of peace I had waited my whole life to feel. 6 months had passed since the day my father and I met at the cafe, and Seattle had shifted seasons again. Spring had arrived quietly, blooming trees lined the streets, the air smelled of wet grass and renewal, and the city pulsed with a soft optimism that mirrored my own. I often thought about how much could change in such a short time. There had been a time when I lived in constant tension, waiting for the next cruel word or painful moment. Now, I woke up to calm mornings, sunlight spilling through my curtains, and the simple sound of peace. Life had become slower but richer. Work still kept me busy, but I'd learned to draw boundaries there too. No more 12-hour days or endless overtime just to prove myself. I had proven enough. My team respected me not just for my skills but for the way I led, with empathy, patience, and strength. I had become a mentor to younger engineers, many of them women trying to find their place in an industry that could often be unkind. Every time one of them thanked me for believing in them, I felt a quiet sense of purpose take root. This, guiding others, helping them believe in their worth, felt like healing. My penthouse no longer felt like a fortress, it had become a home. I redecorated the living room, painting one wall a warm shade of beige and filling the space with books and plants. I adopted a rescue cat named Olive, a tiny gray creature who followed me from room to room and slept curled beside me every night. Sometimes I'd laugh and tell her, "You're the only roommate I'll ever trust." The way she'd blink up at me with sleepy affection made even the loneliest nights feel full. I also began reconnecting with parts of myself I had buried for years. I took up painting again, the same art I had once begged for as a child. My first canvas was clumsy, all uneven lines and mismatched colors, but I didn't care. The act of creating something just for me felt liberating. I played soft jazz while I painted, losing track of time in the rhythm of brushstrokes. Healing, I realized, wasn't a single event. It was 1,000 small choices made every day to reclaim joy. Every Sunday, I visited my grandfather. After the court case, he had distanced himself from the rest of the family, choosing to live quietly near the outskirts of the city. We would sit on his porch, sharing tea while the sound of seagulls echoed in the distance. He often told me stories from his youth, about love, mistakes, and redemption. "The trick, Andrea," he once said, his eyes twinkling, "is not to let pain turn you bitter. Let it make you wiser." I smiled because, for the first time, I understood exactly what he meant. My father occasionally called, and though our conversations were brief, they were genuine. We spoke about work, the weather, small things. There was no pretense, no guilt. Just two people learning to rebuild something fragile with respect. He never asked me to forgive my mother or brother again, and I respected him for that. As for Norma and Frank, they remained silent, bound by the restraining order and their own choices. Sometimes I wondered if they ever thought about what they'd lost. But then I'd remind myself that wondering didn't matter. Their silence no longer had power over me. One evening, I hosted a small gathering at my place. Just friends from work, my therapist Dr. Turner, and a few neighbors who had become like family. We ate homemade pasta, laughed about office mishaps, and shared stories about the moments that had changed us. As I looked around at the warm faces and heard the sound of laughter filling the space, I realized this was what family could be, not blood but belonging. After everyone left, I stood on the balcony, looking out over the city lights. The view was breathtaking, the Space Needle glowing in the distance, reflections shimmering on the water. Seattle had always felt cold to me when I first arrived, but now it felt alive, like the city itself had witnessed my transformation. I thought about the girl I once was, the quiet child desperate for approval, the young woman who believed her worth depended on others' acceptance. I wished I could reach back in time and tell her, "You are enough, even when no one tells you so." Maybe that's what healing really was, learning to become the person your younger self needed. As midnight approached, I picked up my journal, the one I had started during therapy, and flipped through its pages. The early entries were filled with pain, anger, confusion. But as I turned to the most recent pages, I saw peace in my own handwriting. The last entry read, "I am not defined by the family that failed me, but by the courage that saved me. My worth is not measured by love withheld, but by love I learned to give myself." I smiled, closing the journal gently. I no longer needed to write about survival. Now, I wanted to write about living. The next morning, sunlight poured into my kitchen as Olive meowed impatiently for breakfast. I laughed, poured her food, and brewed a pot of coffee. I opened my laptop, not for work, but to start something new, a blog for women who had survived emotional abuse, a space to share stories, strength, and recovery. I called it Unbroken. It felt right. Within weeks, the blog gained readers, women from different cities, different ages, all with the same kind of pain in their stories. I responded to every message, sometimes with advice, sometimes with just 3 words, "I understand you." And every time I wrote those words, I realized I truly did. Months later, as summer approached, I found myself at peace in a way I had never known. I wasn't chasing happiness anymore. It had quietly found me in the small, ordinary moments: morning sunlight, laughter with friends, the purring of a cat, a cup of coffee that didn't taste bitter anymore. Standing on my balcony one evening, I whispered into the cool breeze, "I made it." The city below seemed to hum in agreement. My life hadn't turned perfect, but it had turned real. I didn't need their validation, their approval, or their presence. What I needed was myself, and after years of being unseen, unheard, and unloved, I had finally found her. As I watched the sun sink behind the Seattle skyline, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose, I smiled softly and whispered, "The slap that once broke me became the sound that woke me." And with that, I closed the door to my past forever, and opened the window to my new beginning. If you've made it this far, it means you've walked through my story with me. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, make sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss the next one. And I'd really love to know, where are you watching this from, and what time is it there right now? Drop your answer in the comments. I can't wait to read them.